Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining this rights-based approach in disaster responses session today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging First Nations peoples as the sovereign custodians of the country and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge and value the distinct culture, customs and practices present in the many and diverse First Nations across the lands on which we live and work. I would like to extend that welcome and acknowledgement to any First Nations people joining us today. My name is Megan Nicholson. I'm Director of the NCOSS Community Sector Disaster Capability Project. Sorry about that. Which is a project funded through the Disaster Risk Reduction Fund by the state and Commonwealth governments. I am coming to you today from the lands of the Wandi, Wandian and Jerrinja people on the New South Wales South Coast. In the chat function, if you could introduce yourselves, your name, your organisation and the lands that you're on today, that would be it's a really nice way of understanding who's in the room. This session is a continuation of NCOSS's ongoing human rights approaches discussion series, which started in 2021. You can access the previous presentations and resources on the NCOSS training and events webpage, and we'll be sharing links afterwards by email, including slides and recordings if the technical side goes well. Okay. Just a few guidelines on the session today. For smooth discussion, I really encourage our speakers and participants just to be mindful of the time. We have an hour and a half to get through quite a lot, and I'm sure there's going to be great discussion. So, but please be mindful that time is relatively tight. The session that we're going to have today is outlined here on the slide. So you can see part one, we'll be reviewing, going through some basic information, context, and a bit about human rights principles. In part two, we'll be hearing from our panel members today applying rights-based principles in disaster contexts. And in part three, there'll be a chance for us all to reflect and share our own perspectives, thoughts on what we've heard. So I will now hand over to Eleanor Harris to take you through part one.
Thank you very much, Megan. My name's Eleanor Harris. I'm the Senior Project Officer for the Community Sector Disaster Capability Project. And thank you for coming today. It's great to see that so many people were interested in the session. We hope you find it useful. I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Darlinghurst in Sydney. I acknowledge First Nations peoples as the sovereign custodians of country and pay respects to elders of past and present. I also pay my respects to First Nations peoples with us today. In thinking about the impact of disasters on people, I'm reminded to listen to our First Nations people who understand their land, waters and seasons and how to live in balance with them, who understand and acknowledge the power and importance of the connection between all people and things, and who know the cost when people's rights are not protected and the hard work required to highlight these issues and advocate for a better system. So today we've used the term disaster responses, and we've tried to do in that, we've tried to capture a very broad array of the community sector's role in disasters and disaster context. And this may include for you providing material and emotional support, it may be providing support in the short and longer term recovery, and it may actually be providing your core services to people as they navigate the issues that are exacerbated after the disaster event. We'll focus on the concept of disaster risk reduction. So what it means and what actions you are taking or can take to reduce disaster risk for the people we work with. Just as a note, I'd also like to say that many of us have experienced at least one disaster recently, be it a pandemic, flood, fire, or another crisis. And I acknowledge that there is often pain, anger, and frustration when we think about our own or others' experiences of those disasters. Those feelings are normal. Disaster responses in the last few years have not been adequate to the challenges that have been presented to us. And we've seen that particularly people who are vulnerable are often the most impacted by these events and often have the least resources to recover well. So as Megan said, let's, for smooth running, let's make sure we respect each other and be kind to each other in the session. And if this brings up anything for you and you feel a bit distressed, please do reach out to your support networks when you can. So large-scale and frequent climate hazards have forced us to think in really new ways. It's no longer realistic to think about singular responses to singular disaster events. We're in a transformative time now when many people in different sectors, in impacted communities with different abilities are thinking, what can I do with my experience and my role and my expertise to ensure this doesn't happen again? So these climate and health hazards will continue with increasing frequency and scale, but they don't have to become disasters. We all have knowledge, experience, expertise, and I believe a really strong motivation to significantly reduce the risks we face from these hazards. So I want to thank Rosalita especially. When we were looking at putting this session together, we thought human rights-based approach and disaster risk reduction. We looked at the literature, we looked at what's happening internationally, and there's quite a bit making a link between those two things. But then we looked around in Australia and it's only really a beginning conversation here. So there wasn't a lot of resources around looking at the link between human rights-based approach and disaster risk reduction. So we've stuck at it and we've come up with what we hope is an interesting presentation for you today. But it's only just a beginning conversation. So we're not going to give you answers to everything. We're going to show you some great examples from our fantastic panelists today. But it's sort of just touching on what is disaster risk reduction and how can we apply a human rights-based approach. And you might have some other ideas and activities that you're doing as well that you want to share. So let's first do a really fast unpacking of disaster risk reduction.
You want me to take it over, Eleanor, for this one?
I'll just introduce it and I'll let you jump in, Lisa. Thank you. I was just going to say very quickly, so disaster risk reduction can be very technical. So Lisa Cameron DeVries from Phoenix Resilience is here to help me out if I stumble over any of the technical bits. But very briefly, the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction and most of the literature expresses disaster risk reduction as hazard by exposure by vulnerability. So disaster risk is the interaction between the hazard event and people's exposure and vulnerability. So hazards, vulnerability and exposure are influenced by a number of risk drivers, including poverty and inequality, badly planned and managed urban and regional development, climate change, and environmental degradation. Lisa, did you have anything you wanted to add in this slide here?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a very interesting concept to look at it this way, because there's many, many hazards we can face, and weather is definitely one that's been top of the agenda. But we've had pandemic, it can be severe weather, tsunami, earthquake, volcanic eruption, space weather. It could be all sorts of things, but it only becomes an issue if we have those other factors as well, exposure and vulnerability, there was a category 5 in Western Australia recently, but if there's not that many people living there, then it has completely different consequences than when it directly hits an urban environment or a very cultural significant site, right? So that is then feeds into the exposure, where we are located, where we live, informs if it turns into a disaster. And that can be also where the infrastructure is that we built. If we build our houses to certain building codes, we're much more resilient. If we have alarms in place and infrastructure that warns us and assists us and keeps us safe, that reduces our exposure. Then finally, there's the vulnerable piece, and that's where the human rights component really comes in, because vulnerable people are disproportionately adversely affected. So we're having that human rights frame of mind, reducing the vulnerability, that's what that human rights-based approach is about. And when we think about vulnerability, there's some people that are just physically unable to get out of harm's way, or that they can't understand or hear or see the warnings that are being issued. They don't have the financial means to protect themselves or get out of harm's way, or responders don't really understand the cultural needs and values and what is important in their response. So, but it also works from the way the community support organizations themselves and their vulnerability. And what we saw in COVID was that it's certain community support organizations that had high groups of elderly volunteers, for example, they couldn't participate. Others have lower financial means, so they're not that resilient, and during a situation that actually adversely affected themselves. And here in Brisbane during the last flood, the Red Cross had office flooded, so they were not able to actually provide the services that they needed to formulate their response. So it works two ways. It's the vulnerability of the community as well as the community support organization. And that's really, I think, important to when you think about means to reduce disaster risk.
Mm. Thanks, Lisa. We do break down a little bit more in the next slide some of the work that the community sector actually is doing or can do around disaster risk reduction. So we've broken down those elements that we just discussed. They're in a little structure that's looking at a balance. So in this model, they're balancing the exposure and the hazard with addressing socioeconomic vulnerability and lack of coping capacity, which here in this diagram is talking about organizational capacity, which Lisa was just speaking to, and that social capacity, so that sort of collective capacity as opposed to individual capacity here. So I've just put in here some examples, and you might be able to think of other examples as well. So initiatives to address hazard. So for example, the NCOSS Fair, Fast and Inclusive Climate Change Action platform is looking at, what action can we take to reduce the impacts of climate? And so hopefully those future hazards are not as severe as anticipated. So in terms of reducing exposure, so thinking about heat exposure, there's the Better Renting Sweaty and Stressed report. So bringing the issue of vulnerability around heat stress and, poor renting conditions is another way that we're trying to address exposure. It's another example. Addressing exposure and vulnerability. So for example, Centre for Just Places, which is Jesuit Social Services, which I always struggle to say. And they are looking at the intersection of climate change impacts with existing inequalities. And also we'll hear from a couple of panelists today who are also talking about projects that try and address both the exposure to disasters and also vulnerability as well. So reducing socioeconomic vulnerability is a great way to address disaster risk, and that can be your work. That's your work, your everyday, working with your clients. Lack of coping capacity, again, in talking about organisational capacity and social capacity, social capital, sorry. An example is the project that I'm working on. So the Community Sector Disaster Capability Project is a partnership between NCOSS, ABSEC and LCSA, and we're working with local organisations in 3 target locations, and we're looking at supporting them to strengthen connections between local disaster agencies and systems and build capacity to reduce disaster impacts, particularly with vulnerable communities. So looking more at that system and how it works and how we can reduce risks by working better together. So that is an example that I thought fit quite well there. So there's probably some examples that you've got as well of work that you know of or work that you're undertaking that's either that broader work that's your core work that you usually do and reduces vulnerability, or it might be specifically targeted at disaster risk reduction or preparedness and planning. If you have some examples you would like to share, please pop them into the chat. So you touched on organisational capacity a little bit already, Lisa. Did you want to speak to that a little bit more for this slide here?
Yes, I was very busy replying to all the interesting comments as well in the chat.
Great.
That's going excellent. Yes, so with community support organizations, so that is absolutely what I mentioned before. They contribute to reducing the disaster risk. So the services they provide, sometimes community support organizations are, one of them might be the only one that is looking after a specific vulnerable group. So you have the duty and the responsibility to be able to provide that service when the time is there, when the need is highest. But the problem is you're also affected by the disaster. So this is a really challenging point you're in. But it is important to recognize that and plan for it and think ahead of this is like these people need me, but I need to be able to provide that service. So think of it now, what you can put in place to ensure that you can actually do that. Because like I mentioned, we are all responsible for reducing that vulnerability as a collective of community support organizations, and we have to be able to be prepared and ready to do that when the time is there.
And it's really good to actually, well, just before I go on to the next slide, actually think about our own capacity as well, because I think especially in the community sector, we have to respond to that need. And sometimes we have to actually step back and think, well, we're impacted as well. And, what can we actually physically do?
And the challenge, I just wanted to add to that, the challenge is that it is a sector that we're not like have massive funds and amazingly resilient buildings and fancy processes and everything in place. We always have to make do with what we have already. So I totally understand that this is challenging. So then it comes to smart ways of how do we build our resilience by working together, collaborating, so that we, between space, people, resources, processes, that we can come together and help each other. Yeah. Great.
And we'll have a little bit more of a think about that as well when we get to accountability, which Lisa is talking to as well. Okay, great. So in our whirlwind tour of disaster risk reduction, I'll continue. So we've got a bit of a description here of two very different ways of working that often appear at the same time. So traditional emergency management thinking is often very top-down, command and control, which often makes a couple of assumptions about communities. First, it sees other forms of social organisation, like community-based organisations, as separate to the emergency action. So it's not in the plan, it's separate. And spontaneous actions by affected communities or groups are often viewed as irrelevant or sometimes as disruptive because they're not under the control of the authorities. The second assumption is that disasters produce passive victims who are overwhelmed by crisis or engage in dysfunctional behaviour. So they therefore need to be told what to do, or the behaviour must be controlled. But as we've seen, and as we will see, hearing from people, much recent disaster response, recovery and preparedness has highlighted a different way of working. So emphasising the importance of communities and local organisations in disaster risk management. The rationale for community-based disaster risk management is that it responds to local problems and needs, capitalises on local knowledge and expertise, is cost-effective, improves the likelihood of sustainability through genuine ownership of projects, strengthens community, technical and organisational capabilities, and empowers people by enabling them to tackle these and other challenges. But how do these two very, very different approaches work together? And I think we're in the process of trying to figure that out now. And I think there's a lot of willingness actually on both sides to try and figure out how these two very different approaches work. Again, the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction sees successful disaster risk reduction as a combination of top-down institutional changes and strategies, with bottom-up and local community-based approaches. So the challenge and where the human rights framework comes in. So it's acknowledged that socioeconomic inequality as well as disaster risk is likely to continue to increase for communities that have limited opportunities to manage their risk and strengthen their resilience. So many of you may have seen this, you may have experienced it. If your community has been through a disaster, the people with the least resources are at the most risk. So bringing in a human rights-based framework gives us a couple of opportunities. It's understanding how inequality and risk interact with each other. It's giving us the tools to empower people to build a resilient life. And it's holding government, institutions, and we as a service providers accountable. So a rights-based approach is turning the human rights from purely legal instruments and laws into effective policies, practices, and practical realities. So the Australian Human Rights Commission acknowledges that the application of the human rights-based approach varies according to the nature of the organisation and the issues, but we have the principles that we can apply in our work, and you probably use these in your normal day-to-day work. We're having a look today with the help of our panelists at how they can be applied in various different disaster contexts. So the panel principles, I'm saying panel too many times today, I'm sure I'll trip over that, is our participation, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and laws. So I'm just going to pass back to Megan to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Eleanor, and also Lisa for your support there. That was a very impressive, succinct dive into what is disaster risk reduction and the sort of the human rights framing of that. So look, I'm really, really pleased to introduce our panel members today who will share their insights about the work that they're doing using the panel principles, which Eleanor touched on there: participation, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and laws, or the legal side of things. So just quickly run through who we're going to be hearing from. So Faye Jackson is the General Manager of Inclusion at Flourish Australia, which is a mental health and disability service organisation. I'm sure you're all aware. Faye is a multi-award winner in human rights and disability, and as a member of the Mud Army in the first responders in northern New South Wales during the big floods in early 2022. So we'll be hearing from Faye. Lisa Cameron de Vries, who we've already heard from, is the Technical Director of Phoenix Resilience. She has nearly 2 decades of experience working with NGOs across the Middle East, Asia, and Australia. And she provides disaster risk reduction advice to services at all levels of government, as well as for not-for-profit organisations. Lisa's worked with community support organisations in responding to and recovering from various crises. We'll be also hearing from Grant South. He's a social worker and project lead of Nganya Jarjam's Planning for Disaster project. This project aims to develop culturally safe disaster preparedness tools and work with families in developing their own disaster management plans. Nganya Jarjam, as I'm sure you're aware, is an Aboriginal child and family network working in the Bundjalung Nation in the Clarence Valley, Richmond and Tweed Valleys. And we'll also be hearing from Anne Crestani. She's a project lead with Resilient Villages Blue Mountains, Anne's been leading teams and projects that are focused on supporting people and communities impacted by disaster events. And she's a passionate advocate and supporter of community-informed and community-led resilience planning and action. So welcome to all our panel members. And Eleanor will also be leading the conversation and being a panel member herself. So go for it, Eleanor. So I'll hand over to Eleanor to lead the panel discussion. But please do continue to contribute through the chat. And also for those of you who like to sort of start forming up your thoughts, we will pop a couple of questions in the chat that we will focus on later. So over to you, Eleanor.
Great, thanks, Megan. I would jump quickly to the next slide. So today, to break down the principles a little bit and apply them in the disaster context, we're using the Scottish Human Rights Commission's Human Rights-Based Approach Self-Assessment Tool. And when Rosalita gets a chance, she'll pop that link into the chat as well. So they have a variety of questions that you can ask when you're thinking about applying these principles to whatever work you're doing. And Rosalita's put some of those questions into the slide. So what we're going to do, we'll speak to each panelist and we've given them a principle and we've asked them, what are the realities of translating this particular principle into practice in their experience? And also, what are the top 2 tips for community organisations around translating a principle into practice? So the first principle is participation, and that's enabling meaningful participation of all key people and stakeholders. So I'll just give you a moment to look at the questions there while Faye is getting ready. So Faye, I'm looking at the screen and I can't actually see everybody, but are you ready to go?
Yes.
Great. Faye, you've had some very personal experience of the floods with yourself and your family members being impacted by the Northern Rivers floods. Looking at the principle of participation, what are the realities of translating that principle into practice?
I think the realities thus far is that it has been done too little too late in the piece. We, in the Northern Rivers, and I acknowledge Grant, Michelle, Elle and Brett, who are all online from Bundjalung Nation, which is the Northern Rivers of New South Wales. We had, first of all, the fires that went through 2 summers ago, where everybody said rainforest doesn't burn. It burnt, we burnt here. And that burned the trees off the side of the mountains, and then and that dislodged rocks, which was actually huge boulders that flattened houses back when the fires were going on. And people were saying that what they couldn't cope with was hearing the koalas screaming. That was what was in their minds so much through what was going on. And then the rains came, the flood hit, and because the trees were gone from the sides of the slopes in some areas, we weren't dealing just with rising waters. We were dealing with huge mud falls and taking houses and landscape with it, and people. And this impacted. This and the floods impacted thousands and thousands of people. We've thought that after the fires that there might be more interaction with the emergency services, with the local people, to try and get more prepared, because during the fires we were told we were given the opportunity to come together in the hall in Mullumbimby, where we were met by police officers, different people in uniforms, which is really very confronting for people who are asylum seekers or Aboriginal people, people with lived experience of mental health issues. Those uniforms can be quite frightening. And so there needs to be a kind of a preparedness for the powers, perhaps to not don uniforms when they're bringing messages to people. But what they told us in that hall that day when the fires were surrounding us, that if we lived anywhere where there was only one road in and that was it, then we were on our own. We were basically told that no emergency services would come because of the risk of life to the emergency services. When the floods hit, where we live up, I live near Mullumbimby, Brunswick Heads, and all up here, we had no emergency personnel here because they were all sent down to Lismore to prepare Lismore. So when the floods hit here so badly, and my daughter was rescued out from under the water by someone, and she lost everything. There were no emergency services up here. We were all just neighbours helping neighbours. We were all just people helping people. We did what we could with what we had in that extreme, remembering that it started to unfold at night hours during the night. And at that time, when we were working, when we were trying to save people, when we were working they called us the mud army, but they should have called us the shit army, really, because we were working in sewerage. When we were working, we were just doing, everybody had to work together. Everybody had to be involved. And it was very obvious that we were working with people who were hearing voices. We were working with very elderly people, and everybody had to pull their weight. Old, very elderly people were holding babies while mothers were doing what they could do to save their neighbours or to clean up after it. So we really need to recognise that the marginalised communities, we have a very big problem up here with homelessness, which we did before the floods hit, the fires and floods hit, but it's much more extreme now. But we need to recognise that homeless people, elderly people, people with mental health issues, asylum seekers, all of those people, very often Aboriginal people often have had have experienced trauma at the hands of people in uniform. We need to be engaging with these people before, very well in advance, when there isn't a crisis on, to find out what it is that's needed and to do a real co-design process around this. Very often services, emergency services, bureaucrats come to people with a plan and then say, what do you think about this? And it's really about a tick box kind of situation. And what we really need is for them to be coming to us saying, what is it? What are the questions that we need to ask you? Ask the services that are here. And remember that many of the services were wiped out as well in the floods here. So that the people who operated those services needed to manage their own situation, their families, and then their work, for the communities. What is it? What are the questions that we need to ask? Because if the emergency services, the bureaucrats are asking the wrong questions, they will get the wrong answers, and then we get the wrong outcomes. And what we saw here was that the local people, the volunteers, which we didn't see ourselves as volunteers. We were just neighbours doing what we had to do in that extreme circumstance. That we were there for each other. We were just doing what we had to do, and everybody had to do it. And everybody respected everybody for what they could actually do. And there should never be a time where any people, whether they are voice hearers, whether they're old people, whether they're asylum seekers that have only been here a short while, or Aboriginal people that have had a number of times where, they've been subject to the law that has traumatize them, where they're not asked. They must be asked.
Yeah.
And they must be given the power to set the questions so that the right answers can come.
And that really draws out, again, looking at equality as well, Faye, because you are going to these communities and saying, what do we need to ask you, and starting from the beginning, as opposed to saying, this is what we have in our mind, this is what we need to tell you. So it's sort of that coming to that principle of equality as well, and saying, starting on that equal footing. It's not authority and, you know, victims that need to be told what to do. It's experts in their area, in their experience, and asking them, you know, where do we start? So that's a fantastic point as well, and showing that disaster is a great leveler, I suppose, in that everybody came together and just did things. So it can be done. Even people who are experiencing, as you said, mental health issues, that they're hearing voices, they still got in and helped. You know, it's not that they couldn't do anything and they were helpless victims. Everybody got in and helped. But it'd be great to have that ongoing connection, so we can sort of reduce that fear around formal structures and people in uniform, so we can have that conversation a little bit more effectively and equally and respectfully, I suppose. Do you have any advice for ensuring people with lived experience are partners in disaster risk reduction? You've probably answered that a little bit already, but did you have any other advice there?
I guess, you know, the attitude about people with lived experience of mental health issues, unfortunately, still carries a lot of discrimination and stigma, though I don't like the word stigma, because I think people get away with discrimination by using the word stigma. I'm a voice hearer, and I was certainly involved in the acute stage and the aftermath, when my hands became poisoned from the sewage in the mud and I couldn't do that work anymore. I donned plastic gloves and started cooking and driving driving food around. You know, like, people with lived experience, we're acutely aware, because our lived experience usually comes from a base of trauma. We're acutely aware, unfortunately, and hyper alert, unfortunately, to any danger. And we can be the canaries in the cave, which is a terrible way of the canaries in the mine of looking at it. But we and Aboriginal people the same, you know, we recognise when there's danger coming very, very early, because we're acutely aware of danger. And we should be given the respect and the opportunity to give advice as well as help. If we can help in those acute situations, which we did, and I was not the only voice here. I don't respond to my voices usually, not when other people are around me, but there were other people involved in this saving people and the cleanup that were responding to voices. If we can be of service to our community in those acute situations, then surely to God, we can be of service to our community in the pre-planning and the post-vention. We're here and we need that opportunity. Our communities need everybody to be able to play their part in an acute crisis.
I think you may have started to answer the next question for you, Faye. What are your top 2 tips for community organisations around translating participation into practice?
Well, I think we should drop the word participation, to be honest with you. I think we should be another P, which is partnership. So we need to be partnering with people from marginalised communities. I don't actually like using that term marginalised, because every time I think you speak it, it reinforces the marginalisation. But you know what I mean. We need to be asking them and giving them the respect that they have. What we did see when the army finally came, first of all, the first part that we saw of the army was just a media stunt where they pulled up with their vans, got out with their new spades and their new uniforms and a camera person, and looked like they were digging. But when they actually came to help, then there was just this total disrespect of the local knowledge of the people that were handling the situation. As I said before, we had no one here from emergency personnel, emergency machinery or anything to help us. But when the army came in, it was just like it was like everything we were doing was wrong. I tell you what, we saved thousands of lives, and we did, you know, thousands of hours of work between us in keeping people fed. People were starving in the days afterwards. We had no power, we had no electricity, no phones, no internet, no fuel, no cash, no way of getting food. No, like it was Armageddon just overnight. And we all managed it incredibly well with a officially small number of deaths. And all of us, including the people who are elderly, who hear voices, who have extreme anxiety, who are Aboriginal, who are asylum seekers, homeless people, we all played our part because we're valuable members of the community if we're given that opportunity. They need to ask us. They need to do it in a respectful way, preferably without uniforms, alongside locally respected and trusted people like Aboriginal elders. Let them lead it. The army and different services are an order, a command and obey kind of situation. That's not the way you can get the best out of and create trust and relationship with Aboriginal people and people with lived experience and asylum seekers. It needs to be trusting relationships built over time so that the trust is already there before the crisis hits.
Yeah. So exactly, Faye. So there's that question in from the self-assessment tool that says, are people with lived experience equal partners throughout? So you've made that great point that, yes, going back, the disaster risk reduction process, the thinking, how do we make sure it's not this bad next time? And having that respect and that equal relationship is really important. So thank you so much for sharing your experience, Faye, and your personal experience as well. It shows, and other people here today will know that the impact is not just being impacted yourself, but seeing the impact on others as well can be really confronting. So I thank you very much for sharing your personal experiences. We are moving on now to the next principle. Also, if you have questions for any of the panelists, pop them in the chat or keep them for the end. Hopefully we will be on time and we'll have some time to speak to the panelists directly. But I'll keep moving now. The next principle is accountability. So ensuring clear accountability, identifying who has legal duties and practical responsibilities for a human rights approach. So in the NCOSS human rights-based approach sessions in the last couple of years, it was emphasised that we as providers of social services are also accountable for providing support to those who need it. So we have an accountability as well. So in a disaster context, we need to both hold government and institutions to account, but also we have to have a think about how we're accountable to the community. So we've already met Lisa. She's the technical lead at Phoenix Resilience. And Lisa, again, in my tiny screen, I can't always see if everybody's there, but I think you're still there. So you worked with community support organisations in the Moreton Bay area to develop a COVID recovery plan. Tell us a little bit about the capability mapping process you led the community organisations through.
Yeah. And before introducing that, I just wanted to touch on what Faye mentioned, because the space I work in is that interface between community support organisations, government, emergency services, and the community. So everything that's said, I will be taking forward anyway in the planning process to really learn from that particular insight. Because it's not out of people's ill will that certain things don't happen. I spend time in these coordination centres. They're completely under the pump. They don't sleep. They're trying to do the absolute best for the community, but they don't know these things that you just mentioned, a lot of them. So if they know and raise awareness, then we can build better responses in the future. So these places where we share these lessons amongst each other is great, but we also need to make sure that it makes its way to them. So I'll help there. Anyway, so what we did for COVID, when COVID hit, and luckily in the Moreton Bay area, the local government works very closely with the community support organizations and emergency services. And immediately it was realized that we need to come up with a COVID recovery plan, basically preparedness. It was kind of response, preparedness, recovery, all at the same time. As you know, that time was very turbulent. And the point was that we got all the community support organizations together, all the various vulnerable groups, and we got them in a room and really understood, firstly, what it meant for them. So where are you affected by this? So some didn't have access to volunteers, others needed to have certain documents and insurances in place all of a sudden that they had no knowledge of, others needed legal advice and they didn't have that, but others did have that, others needed, it was between people, space, resources, admin, all that sort of stuff that people needed. Some had and others didn't. So first it was about mapping where the gaps were and where others had that capability, so that we could build that network where we can assist each other, because you're not going to do it on your own. By working together, we built that resilience from that perspective. And then it was about mapping what this means for the community. So for each vulnerable group, it meant something different. For the elderly, it meant that they could not receive their meals on wheels, or they could not go out, and they were socially isolated. For people in domestic violence situations, it meant that they now were stuck in the place that is the biggest threat for them. From cultural, it was many different ways that vulnerable people were affected. And so then it was about mapping that to have an optimum strategy across emergency services, government and community support organizations towards meeting those community needs. So with that, when we're talking about human rights-based approach and vulnerable people first, I know in those, every time we go into a recovery planning stage with all these agencies, the first thing, we build templates, the first question is, what are the community needs? And that is a point of mapping that. So that's completely, at least in the coordination centres here that we walk into, because of the Queensland disaster management arrangements, which you want to touch on as well, it's ingrained in the thinking. It's literally the first question: what are the community needs? And then mapping all of those and then working the best strategy towards that. So yeah, so that work was really valuable to understand and building those networks. And we've repeated that in various other local governments in floods and other disasters.
There's a question here, Lisa, about gaps and how do you fill capacity gaps in the self-assessment tool. Did any of the service identify, there's something that is needed that none of us can do? Was there, did they identify that, and did they find any ways to address that gap?
That's because the challenging thing of disasters is the lack of funds, and funding requests and all that sort of stuff, that takes a lot of time. So, and that is something that is across the services, I suppose, to get that sort of thing going. I suppose that's one of the challenging ones. But it's just about working together and collective. It's all about your local network. It comes down to knowing the people in that, and even Faye touched on that as well, knowing the people in those other organizations, because there's always a resource. There might be an amazing proposal writer in there, and then you can share that resource across, and then you can give something back. And yeah, that's about the local networks. That's what I have found is the most effective response on a community level, on a community support organization level, on a local government level, because the local knowledge and the local relationships make it happen.
And I think that goes again towards the answer about the 2 top tips for community organisations. But before we go there, you did want to touch on briefly the arrangements. So yes. I will jump to those slides.
So yeah, because of the Queensland disaster management arrangements, we have it's mandatory to have a local recovery group that sits under a local disaster management group, and that local recovery group must meet outside of disasters. And that consists of community support organisations, state government, where it's like communities, Department of Communities, those sort of ones, departments of housing, local government, and volunteer organisations and community services, and utility providers sometimes. So it's all about a collective, how all meeting the community needs, because some people depending on power to have their machine the life dependency going, that sort of stuff. So they have to meet outside of disaster. They have to have ways of building those relationships and mapping community needs. So having tools to understand where the vulnerable communities are, and discussing that and practicing that and discussing having methods in place for that. They must exercise, they must practice, and they must continually improve. So when the disaster kicks in, those relationships are already there. So I found that it's been really beneficial, because again, those groups already have templates where the first question is, what are the community needs? How can we meet them? And they go through a process. I know that sounds, tactical, but it helps because it enforces you to think of, I need community needs first. How do I meet them? How do I do that? Who does it? When? Plan, execute, review. It works. So if you go to the next slide, that local recovery group, for example, in Logan that we work with, you can see the membership there consists of government agencies, volunteer organizations, the local representative of local groups, and they all come together and they all map and talk about the local, what's in the local area, what groups are there, what cultural groups are there, what cultural heritage sites are there. And so that awareness already fully exists. So when the response kicks in, it's just a matter of executing it, instead of then having to know where the vulnerable areas are, because it's really, really difficult to find that information when you're in the middle of a response. And like Faye was mentioning, don't try and build relationships during a response as coming in as a government, because that has to be that trust and that relationship and that understanding has to be established before the disaster. Otherwise, So this works just really well.
Yeah, and it's a great example of the technical side that we were talking about and the community side working together. I will have to acknowledge that probably a lot of organizations are thinking, that's a whole nother job. And you did mention also there, when you say there's that whole question about capacity as well.
Yes.
So yes, we're given accountability potentially, formally through being involved in different plans and even legislation in some cases. And then we have that accountability to the community as well. But then, and this is probably for another session, is, okay, we've got all these different accountabilities and things we're required to do. How do we make sure we have the capacity to do that? But that's probably for another day. I don't think we'll get it done in our next couple of minutes. But looking at the self-assessment questions that we had for accountability, and thinking about the accountability principle, what are your top 2 tips for community organisations? And I think you've touched on some of them already, around translating the principle of accountability into practice.
Yeah. And with the accountability thing, like you mentioned, it has to be fair. You can't say you're responsible and accountable, but I'm not going to give you any of the resources. And like I've seen in the Coast Guard, my business partner's in the Coast Guard here, and it's a volunteer job, has to pay for his own uniform, has to always turn up in his time, but it's the only people that go out at that point in time to actually rescue someone. And you just go, it's something in Australia that's unique and amazing. But it's just volunteers. So what is the most important thing if you just want to manage that accountability? I suppose from that point of view, like I mentioned, those local networks is most important, and establishing those with the local emergency services, governments, and your other community support organizations, because then you can build your resilience, understanding where your vulnerabilities are, where that you're short on, thinking now of really innovative, out-of-the-box ways to have potentially workarounds for that in place. Think of that now. I mean, backing up data, that's not something that costs a lot of money. It's just thinking of it. And those sort of things, just putting that in place now. And secondly, when we talk about accountability of government, they can only be held to account if they have the information, and that's up to us. We have that information as community support organizations of where the vulnerable people are, where the cultural heritage sites are, why they're so significant, why they're valuable, and lobby, be organized, be mobilized, and capture that information in ways that you just shove it in their faces and such, like, this is important. And don't give up on that. You are accountable for maintaining these important things that matter to us. And I know that on the other end, people are very receptive to that, if it is often, I can't say always, but I have seen that on the other side, people truly have the best intentions, but just need the information and the tools.
Yeah.
Eleanor,
Excellent.
just wanting to chime in now with the time check.
Yes.
5 to 2. So,
and we've got two more excellent panelists we have to get to. Yes,
right.
I knew this would happen because it'd be so interesting. I'd want to talk on with all the panelists. So I'll keep pushing on, but say the panelists don't have to rush, I do. So going ahead, thank you, Lisa. And now we're talking about the principle of non-discrimination and equality. So discrimination is avoided and attention paid to groups who are made vulnerable. So for this principle, we're talking to Grant South, and Grant, are you there? Sorry, I keep having to check because I can't see the screen.
Jigula, hello.
Hi, Grant. Thank you for joining us today. So
well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm speaking from the beautiful Bunjalung country. So I'm feeling quite blessed at the moment.
Great, thank you. Tell us a little bit about the project you're working on.
Yeah, well, the Planning for Disaster project really was specifically designed to increase disaster and emergency preparedness across Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander households in the Northern Rivers. And really, this is a response that arose after the fires, and it allowed us to hit the ground quite quickly in relation to the big waters. So we were lucky in terms of that pre-planning. And really, that's to do with the vision of Michelle Rogers around that, the project design. And here you can see on this slide, I've wanted to connect theory and practice so that it gives you an overview of how we approached it. So really, from our side, we took a community development and advocacy model, and you can see if we walk around, that theory. Really, when we were talking about developing the project, it was also to educate people that they already possess so much knowledge from their intrinsic life experience. And as Faye hinted at, or mentioned and highlighted, really people were self-organized, and we had to be up here because there just wasn't the type of support that the big cities get, and we're often forgotten about. And so for those people with ears today, I'd like to make that point for all of us. So anyway, this empowerment model, really we want to focus in on rebuilding hope and resilience through empowering our families and community too, and then we walk around that model. So we're planning for and responding to people's own needs wherever possible. And I think this is really important because we are strong, all of us, and we all have strengths. And given the opportunity, we can give birth to both the skills that we have, but also develop new talents. And a lot of us here saw people emerge as natural leaders in disaster through great need. And then there's also to seek support and access resources early in crisis, really to manage disruption and to mitigate or reduce deepening crisis and further hardship. And that was very important. Reduce initial support needs and thereby reducing potential environmental and structural challenges because of some of the human rights issues that arose in the delivery of services. That was an important, was cornerstone really in terms of human rights advocacy, and to minimise the degree of reliance and dependency on the sector disaster support services. And really, this was a protective factor based on the feedback from community that things often didn't go well accessing services, and we were left to our own, really. And so that model was put in place to facilitate and provide guiding principles for the project. And so now I'd like to just move across to the Planning for Disaster Hub. So we developed sorry, still on slide one. Yep. So I had the hub there, and you can see here, to try to give voice to those concerns that arose from that initial needs analysis. We developed the PDF hub, and that was really important to include access to emergency services. A lot of people weren't informed. They weren't informed, and there was a lot of misinformation on the ground, as you can imagine, through the confusion. So that's very important. And then also, we wanted to make sure that there was links to information to around the national radio stations and also regional radio stations, because many people only had radio in some places. It was the only signal that was coming through still, you see. And I think, and on another note, I think national media have a responsible role in conveying emergency information as best they can. And then, you know, it was links to Aboriginal medical services and mainstream services out there, and also charities, because food, as Faye mentioned before, food is really important, particularly in when people are retreated through trauma, and food insecurity. Faye mentioned that people were starving. I mean, this is being well voiced now in terms of our responses. And then we want to make sure that there was links to community transport, the Aboriginal land councils, very important inclusion in our work up here, and also that household pets were looked after. What's happening? Also livestock. What's happening out there with livestock and people's pets. And also we want to make sure that there was regional, state and national mental health and social and emotional wellbeing services.
And so, Grant, all this information is together in one place on the Preparing for Disasters website. On
the website. So people, and this is really, people can go on there. Also in the centre, you'll see in that image there, you've got the household planning tool. And so people go online, they create a tool, they can print it out, and they put it up on an accessible area that all household members can see. And this is particularly important for people who are living with different abilities, and the elderly, and those people who are young, who also need to rehearse. So all that group, that people who are most vulnerable, they really need to rehearse the steps necessary to protect themselves and others in an emergency situation. So that's really, really important. Yeah.
So when we were planning for this, I did have some questions, you know, talking about non-discrimination and equality for Grant, and he reflected back to me some good questions for the sector to consider. So did you want to talk to those as well?
Yes, absolutely. Well, this is it. I mean, you know, you can see here in response to the final report in New South Wales bushfire inquiry, the inquiry was disappointed to learn that in some communities, Aboriginal people felt unwelcome at evacuation centres, and in some cases, support services were reluctant to provide immediate relief. These experiences compounded the trauma that they had already experienced as a result of the bushfires, and in some cases led to people putting themselves at risk as they feared how they would be treated in evacuation centres. So this is not good. And you know, what arose from this is three key learnings to take away. Really, there's a present gap in Commission services, and it's raising human rights issues, particularly around non-discrimination and equality. And there's a present. Whoops, that's my dog. Must excuse me.
Can't really hear him.
Oh, good. A present gap in echo representation. So Aboriginal controlled community organisations, where were they in the front line? We didn't see them, and as Faye mentioned, when some natural leadership arose in community, you know, people were disempowered as other organisations moved in to pick up really the area that they're commissioned to do from the very get-go. And so that was really important to highlight this. A third one is the present gap in First Australian trauma-informed social and emotional wellbeing supports. We're still seeing that out there. Many practitioners are still not aware of how to work as an aligned professional, as an assistant to seek collaboration and partnership. And that's particularly important for people in distress.
Yeah.
They don't want to be made to feel less than. It's already enough.
Yeah.
You know, it's already enough for people to bear. So that has to be highlighted.
And so you've presented as the two top tips there is
yes.
protective factors. Yeah.
Well, I mean, those 3 points naturally gave birth to these 3 reflections. And the 2 points that come from those 3 reflections really is to, seek inclusion of Aboriginal controlled organisations to improve services. This is a protective factor. And so I would say to everybody, you know, all providers and agencies, we should be proactive on this to protect ourselves as organisations and to make sure that we're offering the best service we can. We're in human services. That's the name of what we're here about, is to protect and make sure people are secure and safe. And we need to actualize that in our work consistently. And the last one is to seek culturally informed training, clinical mentoring where it's appropriate, and opportunities for co-design. And again, Faye mentioned that earlier on, and yes, I concur 100%. Yes.
So again, that those equal partnerships, working in partnership,
Absolutely.
we've got expertise and knowledge on both sides that we can bring together. Yeah.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
great. I will make the slides will be available after the recording as well. So thank you, Grant. There's a lot of information in there, but we'll make them available. And thank you for the contribution from your dog as well. We could hear him barking a little bit in the background there. But thank you. So the
Thank you.
principle of non-discrimination and equality, and then we are moving quickly along to empowerment principle. And that is Anne Crestani is talking to that. So empowerment of staff and service users with knowledge, skills and commitment to realise human rights. So Anne, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can. Great. So thanks for joining us, Anne. Your project is Resilient Villages Blue Mountains. Can you tell us a little bit about that work and also some of the work you've done since 2013 in Blue Mountains?
Sure. Thanks, Eleanor. Hi, everyone. I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Darug and Gundungurra people in the beautiful Blue Mountains. And I also just want to acknowledge the incredible wealth of expertise, knowledge and experience sitting in this space today. And can I also acknowledge the presence of significant loss, grief and trauma that is also sitting in this room, and also the fatigue and exhaustion that comes with that. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that travels with us the whole time. So Resilient Villages, I guess thank you so much for the invitation, by the way, as well, Megan, Eleanor and Rosalita. I'll be speaking from the perspective of a local place-based community organisation working alongside local community-led disaster risk reduction initiatives and activities. So Resilient Villages came about following on from obviously the devastating 2019-2020 bushfires, where the Blue Mountains certainly saw our share of devastation and destruction. And the project itself is very much focused on, we hear a lot of rhetoric about community-led recovery, community-led risk reduction, disaster risk reduction, a lot of rhetoric around shared responsibility in terms of recovery and resilience and risk reduction. But what does that actually mean? And what does that actually look like on the ground? And so I guess the Resilient Villages project is an opportunity, of one of many, I'm sure, to actually, if you like, tread that pathway and gather learnings from this experience and share it with the rest of the world, but most particularly our sector. And the Resilient Villages project, basically the aim is to support community-led grassroots initiatives that focus on disaster risk reduction, whatever that support might look like or be relevant for that particular community group or association. So the other part of this project is at the end of it, it's at its core is really there to support local community groups and associations to develop their own resilience action plans, whatever that might look like. So it takes into account the unique characteristics of their neighbourhood, you know, their village, their township, and is designed by the communities themselves. Now, we do have a wonderful team of academic researchers that are part of our team that are travelling alongside us, who are actually, if you like, researching the process of community-led, and also researching the process of what happens when an outside external body, like a local place-based community organisation, partners with a you know, community group to support them and walk alongside them as they, if you like, lead their own either recovery and risk reduction process. So that's what we've been doing. We're not quite a year into the project yet, so really the very early stages of the project have been very much focused on relationship building. And I think relationship building is the key component in terms of, well, not only, you know, building trust, but also in terms of building an accurate understanding and knowledge of what's happening for a particular community, what their wishes, hopes, and desires are, and developing a shared understanding of how we can move forward together. And
that idea of partnership and building trust and connection has come out from everybody speaking today. So it brings back that point of, and I think it's pointing to what our work in disaster risk reduction is a lot, is that building that connection and that ongoing connection and that equal partnership.
Most definitely. And look, the other thing I just wanted to mention, because I will just focus on a particular community association that we're working with, and hopefully that'll provide a little bit of a case study of what this can look like. So there's a particular group who live, the mountains is a funny place. For those of you who are not familiar with the Blue Mountains, we're about 100 k's out from Sydney, and we are embedded in a World Heritage National Park, which is quite vast and huge, wilderness on either side, and most of the settlement is developed along a narrow ridgeline, which is extremely vulnerable to bushfires. We've seen a heck of a lot of them. And so this particular group is a consortium of 3 villages, small villages that are located in an outlying area of the Blue Mountains. So quite tucked away from the more sort of suburban parts of the Blue Mountains. And they were extremely impacted by the 2019-2020 bushfires. It's a very, very small population, and they lost a significant amount of properties during those bushfires. The other thing that they experienced, and the extreme trauma that came with this, was that they had saw very, very few firefighting resources brought to their villages. They were pretty much left to their own devices. And I think that was not only, well, a very traumatizing experience for everybody there, including there are many local community members who are RFS brigade members themselves. And many of them were sent off to fight, you know, to fight fires in other areas. So out of that experience, many of them, and this area is often characterised by people moving to these areas because they want to get away from people. They don't actually want to be, you know, living cheek by jowl with their neighbours. But what happened during the fires, that they actually found themselves all gathered together seeking shelter. And in many cases, that was the first time they had actually met each other. And so that was the starting point where a spontaneous, spontaneous organisation over time has now developed into a formalised group who became incorporated about 12 months ago and made a decision, like many other communities in New South Wales and around the country, that made the decision to say, we know what our community needs in recovery. We know our community best. So we want to have, we want to be front and centre in terms of deciding what sort of resources we need to bring into our community. So, so that's what we're basically doing, walking alongside. We actually have a memorandum of understanding, an agreement with this community, so that our partnership has been formalised, and that outlines the roles and responsibilities of both the Resilient Villages team and the committee, for example, and also it's kind of put us on an equal footing, if that makes sense. And in actual fact, they're leading the process, and we are actually following them.
So it really shows, Anne, that empowerment has come through a difficult situation.
Yes.
Has basically given them that power, and they've taken that agency to be empowered. So, and I put up the slide while you were talking there on those great points you made around empowerment, and which will be available as well later. But also I wanted, because we're running out of time, I wanted to skip to your top tips as well. Did you want to talk to those quickly?
Gosh, 2 top tips is really hard. There's
so she's on 3.
Yes, I get to. Look, really, I think when we think about empower, we've got to think about how power operates, both before, during and after disaster events. So I think it's for people, community organisations who are partnering with local communities and villages and townships, who are wanting to lead their own recovery and risk reduction processes. It helps for both of you to get knowledgeable about how power operates and influences recovery and resilience outcomes. Where are the resources held? How are those decisions made? Because the more knowledge they have, the more able they are to advocate strongly for their community. I think it's important to share this knowledge, to remain curious and ask lots of uncomfortable questions. I think in terms of designing any projects and programs, turn program logics upside down, where empowerment becomes, a primary resilience KPI or outcome, if you like. And the very last thing that I would share is that when you are designing programs and projects, not only ask for longer term funding, because we actually have to adopt longer term thinking. We can no longer operate in short term thinking. We have to demand from our governments that often provide the funding for these programs and projects, that funding is for at least 5 to 10 years, and that it actually reflects the reality of allowing things to emerge. It recognises the complexity of recovery and the complexity of community dynamics.
So exactly what we've been saying throughout, all the speakers have said, building connection, taking time to look at things, and valuing the process perhaps more than the outcome. We're saying that with our project as well. So thank you very much, Anne. It was great to hear from you as well. I knew with our great speakers this would take longer than I had anticipated, but I'm going to talk very quickly to legality. So obviously not as a professional legal person. So if there are any lawyers here or anybody who's had experience of applying human rights law in a disaster context, please share those examples in the chat. We've got a list here of the rights that are most likely going to be affected during a disaster. And in terms of legality, in New South Wales, the other presentations that we had actually looked at the absence of a Human Rights Act in New South Wales and how that impacts or diminishes in a way the ways we can protect rights. So they had some excellent examples of how a Human Rights Act is used in Victoria and in Queensland, and it was to protect rights particularly around tenancy and disability. I don't have a lot of examples of how a human rights-based approach and human rights law is applied to disasters in Australia. I haven't been able to find any, but there is a bit of a sort of belief that because it's a disaster, you know, human rights can be suspended for a while. And that's not actually the case. Bill Mitchell from the Townsville Community Legal Centre has said that all the frameworks around human rights and disasters say that human rights can only be limited in very specific circumstances. So it's not, they can't be suspended indefinitely because it's a disaster event. So how can we ensure in the reality of disaster events that people's rights are protected? It starts with discussions like the one today. So considering our role in disaster risk reduction creates opportunities to take action on what can be done now before a disaster to eliminate or reduce risk to people's basic human rights and the risk that they'll be breached during a disaster event. And action on disaster risk reduction also provides a space for defining what can be done to protect rights after a disaster. So these conversations we're having now is sort of the beginning of how can we make sure that rights aren't breached when a disaster happens. So that's the end of looking at the principles, and I think we've still got a little bit of time before the end of the session because we did want to open it up. So Rosalita, I think this is the point at which you stop the recording.